Christmas is supposed to be the most magical and joyful time of the year, but for the Anderson family, it became the most awful massacre the tiny town of Carnation, Washington, has ever seen.
911?
There's been a murder. There's 3 people dead that I can see right now.
Inside?
I just came up. She works with me.
Inside the house?
Yes.
What do you see?
There's a baby and a man and a woman, and she's my best friend.
On December 26, 2007, Linda Thielu, worried when her best friend Judy Anderson didn't show up for work, went to check on her and made a horrifying discovery. Judy, her husband, their son and his wife, and even their 2 young children, just 5 and 3 years old, had all been brutally murdered. This peaceful town of barely 2,000 people had never seen anything so terrifying. What made the tragedy even stranger was that the only member of the family left alive was Michelle Anderson, Judy's daughter, who was living nearby with her boyfriend, Joseph McEnroe.
I'm sorry, I did because I thought I had to. And yeah, I know that's not a very good excuse, but I'm not trying to excuse myself. I'm just trying to explain my actions. I'm sorry. I'm terrible.
The Anderson family, by all accounts, didn't have any known enemies. They were loved and well respected in the community, which made the whole thing even more confusing. When news of the murders broke, people in town were genuinely shocked and heartbroken, wondering who could have done something so brutal and, more importantly, why.
Seeing everybody die, remembering what I did, how worthless as it is, how worthless I am because I killed all these people. They deserve to die. They deserve to live a lot more than I did, but they died.
To even begin to understand how all of this happened, we have to first talk about the people at the center of it all, the Anderson family. This wasn't just any family. In a small, close-knit town like Carnation, Washington, everyone kind of knows everyone. Lives are often deeply intertwined, so when something this horrifying happens, it hits differently. Based on what witnesses and neighbors have said, the Andersons seemed like your average family, nothing out of the ordinary on the surface. 60-year-old Wayne Scott Anderson, the father, held a solid, well-paying job as an engineer at Boeing. His wife, 61-year-old Judy, was a familiar face in town thanks to her job at the local post office, where she became close friends with a woman named Linda. Yes, the same Linda who later made the 911 call that brought this entire case to light. Linda wasn't just close to Judy either. She seemed to be on good terms with the entire family. Wayne and Judy had 2 children, 32-year-old Scott and 29-year-old Michelle. Now, most parents wouldn't say they had a favorite child, not out loud anyway, but people who knew the family say it seemed pretty obvious that Scott was the golden child. Whether it was because Michelle struggled more or simply because Scott made safer choices, it's hard to say. But the tension was definitely there. Michelle always seemed to be the black sheep. While Scott was building a stable life, marrying a woman named Erica, having 2 young kids, Olivia and Nathan, who were just 5 and 3 years old, Michelle's life looked very different. She still lived on her parents' property, in a small trailer about 200 yards away from the main house. She didn't pay rent, worked a basic job at Target, and had a boyfriend named Joseph McEnroe, who, frankly, many considered a deadbeat. He was unemployed, directionless, and, according to some accounts, a bad influence. To make matters worse, it appeared Michelle might have been harboring deep resentment. Her brother had everything: a loving wife, 2 beautiful kids, a stable job, and the full support of their parents. Erica, Scott's wife, was also very close to Wayne and Judy. Some even believed they treated Erica more like a daughter than Michelle herself. That kind of dynamic, whether spoken or not, can eat away at someone who already feels like an outsider in their own family. On the other hand, Joseph McEnroe came from Santa Clara, California, and while he didn't grow up in Carnation like Michelle did, the 2 had a lot in common. His relatives described him as someone who tried hard to be liked. a quiet guy who loved video games and mostly kept to himself. He wasn't known to be aggressive or mean-spirited. In fact, people remembered him as more of a loner than anything else. But like Michelle, Joseph seemed to drift through life without a solid plan. He didn't have a stable job, no clear direction, and just seemed stuck. Still, even with all those challenges, no one expected his name to ever be connected to anything violent or tragic. Digging a little deeper, though, Joseph's life wasn't as calm as it looked. He struggled with intense anxiety and often found it hard to navigate everyday situations. One thing that really stood out about him was how easily influenced he could be. He sometimes had trouble telling right from wrong, especially in stressful moments. That kind of vulnerability made him a bit of a follower, someone who could be pulled in directions he might not have gone on his own. His relationship with Michelle started in 2001 after they met through a dating app, and it quickly became one of those intense, clingy partnerships that didn't seem all that healthy. The two leaned heavily on each other, but instead of lifting one another up, it was more like they were dragging each other down. They lived together in a trailer just a couple hundred yards from Michelle's parents' home, rent-free but far from comfortable. The place was in poor condition, and with no stable income between them, they were constantly struggling to make ends meet. Joseph didn't have many friends around, and the two of them rarely seemed to interact much with the rest of the town. Now, as mentioned earlier, Joseph McEnroe didn't have the best work ethic. He rarely made the effort to find a job, and when he did manage to get one, it usually didn't last very long. Stability was practically non-existent in his life with Michelle. Meanwhile, Michelle couldn't help but compare their situation to that of her parents, Wayne and Judy Anderson, who were both doing just fine financially. But instead of feeling supported or proud, Michelle felt overlooked, like her parents were intentionally keeping her at arm's length. She believed they weren't doing enough to help her, especially considering they'd brought her into the world. That's how she saw it anyway. Eventually, after letting her and Joseph live rent-free on their property for years, her parents decided it was time to start charging rent. And Michelle didn't take that well. She felt like they were turning their backs on her, and to make matters worse, she also claimed that her brother Scott had borrowed tens of thousands of dollars from her over the years, around $40,000, she said, and had never made any real effort to pay her back. Now, despite all these hardships, Michelle and Joseph were surprisingly the ride-or-die type. They were totally committed to each other, always sticking together no matter how rough life got. They even dreamed of running off to Las Vegas to get married someday. But first, they felt like they had some unfinished business to settle with Michelle's parents, Wayne and Judy. It turned out Joseph had quietly bought 2 guns back in the summer of 2006, a Smith & Wesson Model 19 Magnum revolver and a 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Those weapons were no joke. Then on Christmas Eve of 2007, instead of joining the family celebration, Michelle and Joseph showed up at Wayne and Judy's house with a deadly plan. Judy was in the back room, carefully wrapping presents for her grandkids, trying to keep the holiday spirit alive, while Wayne was somewhere else in the house, getting things ready. But behind that peaceful scene, chaos was creeping in. Joseph kept a gun hidden in his waistband to distract Judy with small talk, while Michelle moved quietly toward her dad with her own gun drawn. She aimed and tried to pull the trigger, but her gun jammed. Panic set in. Joseph quickly rushed in and fired a shot that ended Wayne's life instantly. Hearing the gunfire, Judy ran into the room, only to be met with bullets from Joseph. She fell screaming, and in a chilling moment, Joseph apologized before putting the gun to her head and pulling the trigger. With both parents now dead, Michelle and Joseph must have realized just how badly their plan had gone wrong, but there was no turning back. They knew Scott, Erica, and the kids would arrive any minute, so they scrambled to clean up the mess. They dragged the bodies to a nearby storage shed and frantically tried to wipe away the blood with towels and chemicals, hoping to erase the horror that had just unfolded in that quiet little house. Now Michelle and Joseph did manage to make the place spotless, but it wasn't going to stay that way for long. About 45 minutes after Wayne and Judy were gunned down, Scott arrived at the house with his wife Erica and their kids. The moment he stepped inside, he saw Michelle waiting for him. Things went sideways fast when she pulled out her gun and charged at him. In a desperate attempt to save his family, Scott rushed toward her, but Michelle fired 4 shots straight at him. One of those bullets pierced his neck, and just like that, his life was over. Erica was hit twice in the barrage of bullets, but somehow she held on. She knew she had to do something, anything, to stop the nightmare from getting worse. That's when she spotted a cordless phone nearby. Bleeding and barely able to move, Erica crawled over to the sofa for cover, grabbed the phone, and called for help. She managed to stay on the line only a few seconds before Joseph showed up and snatched the phone away. The operator heard only muffled voices and some yelling, and because she couldn't get clear info, she thought maybe it was just a noisy party getting out of hand. Still, she sent 2 officers to check things out.
Hello? Hello? Hello?
Meanwhile, Joseph ripped the phone apart, yanking out the batteries and crushing it under his feet. Later, he admitted that Erica had been begging him the whole time, even screaming at him not to hurt the kids. All he could do was apologize again and again, but those apologies didn't stop him from finishing what he started. Joseph fired a bullet straight into Erica's head, coldly ending the 2nd generation of the Anderson family, leaving only Michelle alive. But the horror didn't stop there. There was still the youngest generation to deal with. 2 little kids, just 5 and 3 years old. You'd think after all the violence these 2 wouldn't be harmed, but that wasn't the case. Michelle looked at her niece and nephew and instantly saw them as a threat, liabilities that couldn't be allowed to live. She became terrified that if they survived, they could become witnesses in any future trial. The thought of them talking, of secrets slipping out, made her paranoid. So she decided they had to be silenced. But there was one problem. Michelle just couldn't bring herself to pull the trigger. The thought of harming children was too much even for her. So she turned to Joseph, who must have been horrified at the suggestion. But deep down, even he knew the brutal truth behind her words. Together they started rationalizing the unthinkable. They told themselves that the children would be scarred for life by what they had already witnessed, that their innocence was shattered beyond repair, and maybe, in some twisted way, it was kinder to put them out of their misery quickly than to let them suffer forever. It's chilling to think about how they managed to convince themselves of such a thing. Joseph went first, taking Olivia's life with a whispered apology. The little girl's eyes didn't even have time to understand what was happening before the bullet ended her. Then there was 3-year-old Nathan, sitting on the floor, completely unaware, or maybe painfully aware, of the chaos around him. Nathan was playing quietly with the crushed batteries from the cordless phone, innocent and fragile. Joseph later said something haunting about this moment. Nathan looked up at him with full understanding, like the child somehow knew exactly what was about to happen.
If I thought that hurting myself or killing myself or doing anything, that anything I could do would go off and bring back these people or ameliorate the pain or something, I would.
And with that cold detachment, Joseph pulled the trigger once more, ending Nathan's life just like his grandparents, parents, and sister. The deed was done, but then Michelle realized something terrifying. Erica's 911 call had actually gone through. The line was brief, but it was enough for emergency services to be alerted. Panic set in as Michelle understood that the police would be arriving any minute now to investigate what had just happened. So quick as she could, she ran out to the dirt road that led up to the house and locked the front gate behind her, hoping to delay or deter any immediate entry. Just moments later, 2 sheriff's deputies showed up, responding to the 911 call. They approached the locked gate and found it shut tight. No easy way in. They listened carefully, but didn't hear any sounds of a disturbance. No yelling, no crying, nothing that would scream that something was terribly wrong. They even checked with a neighbor nearby, who said they hadn't noticed anything unusual either. Without any more leads or evidence, the deputies decided to leave the scene without digging deeper. That brief, quiet moment gave Michelle and Joseph the small window they needed. But deep down, both of them knew they had crossed the point of no return. They were the sole survivors of a brutal massacre that claimed 6 lives, a horrific act that would forever stain their lives. And despite living just a couple of hundred yards from the crime scene, the police quickly identified Michelle and Joseph as persons of interest. It wasn't a matter of if they'd be suspected, it was when. The investigators would interview them again and again, slowly unraveling the story, and eventually, the truth would become impossible to hide. Whether it was out of clear-headed calculation or just desperate panic, Michelle and Joseph didn't stick around to face the music. They fled, making a run for the Canadian border in hopes of disappearing. But somewhere along the way, they realized that escaping north might not be their best bet after all. Instead, they turned west and headed to Oregon, choosing a different path in hopes of shaking the law off their trail. This meant they had to pass right by Wayne and Judy's property, the very scene of their crime. It's chilling to imagine whether they took a moment to look back, to see the aftermath of what they'd done. Back in Carnation, on December 26th, 2 days after the murder, Linda Thiele, Judy's best friend, started to worry when Judy didn't show up at the post office like she always did. It was totally out of character for Judy, who was punctual and rarely took sick days. Concerned, Linda went over to Judy's house to check on her. Peering through the window, she was met with a sight no one should ever have to see: 2 lifeless bodies lying on the floor. That moment marked the beginning of a nightmare for the whole community, as the horrifying truth of that Christmas Eve massacre slowly came to light. The first 2 bodies she saw were those of Scott and Erica, but in her shock and confusion, she initially thought they were Wayne and Judy. Her mind struggled to make sense of the horror in front of her. At that moment, Linda had no clue that every person inside that house had been shot, executed in cold blood. Instead, her first assumption, as strange as it may sound now, was that maybe it had been some kind of tragic accident. Carbon monoxide poisoning, she thought. That would at least make some sense. But once she stepped through the doorway and into the house, the truth hit her like a freight train. The signs of violence were everywhere: gunshots, blood, the unmistakable scent of death, and any illusion of an accident vanished. Completely distraught, shaking, and barely able to process what she was seeing, Linda called the police. Her voice trembled as she described what she'd just found.
There's 3 people dead that I can see right now. I just came up, she works with me. There's a baby and a man and a woman, and she's my best friend.
This is locked, which makes me wonder if her daughter did it. Which is scary, because then I might be up here with the murderer.
The police swarmed in fast, setting up a perimeter around the house. Yellow tape was stretched across the property, and investigators began carefully documenting the grisly scene, while stunned neighbors looked on in shock. And right at that exact moment, almost like some twisted twist of fate, Michelle and Joseph happened to drive by. As mentioned earlier, they initially planned to flee to Canada, but changed course and were headed to Oregon. Still, something made them stop. Maybe it was guilt gnawing at their conscience, or maybe they just wanted to see what kind of chaos they'd left behind. Whatever the reason, they pulled over, stepped out of the car, and were quickly approached by police. It didn't take long before officers became suspicious. Michelle and Joseph were too close to the scene, too calm, and their timing was just too perfect. They were brought in for questioning, and from there, everything started to fall apart. At first, the couple tried to lie their way out of it. They spun a ridiculous story, saying they were heading to Las Vegas to get married, but it was flimsy, and they both knew it. The weight of what they'd done was crushing them. The pressure finally broke Michelle first. She collapsed in tears during interrogation and confessed. She sobbed through the confession, struggling to speak but wanting to get it all out. Meanwhile, Joseph stayed quiet. He insisted he was innocent, but that didn't save either of them. Both Michelle and Joseph were formally charged with 6 counts of first-degree homicide for the deaths of Wayne, Judy, Scott, Erica, and the 2 little children, Olivia and Nathan. The initial investigation proceeded rapidly, but the actual trial would not begin until almost 3 years later. This delay was due in large part to pre-trial motions, psychological evaluations, and the complexity of the evidence that had to be carefully analyzed and verified. The trial officially kicked off in the summer of 2008, when both defendants were formally arraigned and prosecutors laid out the horrific details of the case. During these early court proceedings, Michelle initially denied full involvement, but the mounting pressure, combined with the overwhelming evidence, ranging from forensic reports to phone records and chilling witness testimonies, eventually led her to a dramatic confession. It was in late 2008, several months into the trial, that Michelle broke down in tears on the witness stand and admitted she was the mastermind behind the massacre. Meanwhile, Joseph McEnroe maintained his claim that Michelle was the controlling force behind the murders, portraying himself as someone manipulated into complicity. However, prosecutors methodically dismantled this defense over the course of the trial, presenting evidence that showed Joseph was an active participant. Despite his claims, the jury was persuaded by the prosecution's argument that both Michelle and Joseph shared responsibility for the horrific acts. The community followed every twist with heavy hearts and growing impatience as the trial stretched on month after month. By early 2009, the prosecution was pushing hard for the death penalty. The 6 counts of first-degree homicide carried the possibility of the harshest punishment available under Washington state law. Prosecutors painted a picture of cold-blooded killers who had shown no remorse and had carried out a meticulously planned and savage attack on their own family members, including 2 young children. Public opinion was largely in favor of the death penalty, reflecting the anger and grief felt by many in the community. Yet, on January 31, 2013, after years of hearings, the presiding Judge Jeffrey announced a surprising decision. The death penalty was off the table for both defendants. Citing evidentiary and procedural considerations, the judge ruled that life imprisonment without the possibility of parole would be the maximum sentence. While many expected capital punishment for such a brutal crime, the law required careful adherence to rules ensuring fairness and due process. The lengthy wait for a resolution had frustrated some, but it underscored the complexities of administering justice in the most serious cases. Realizing that the death penalty was no longer a looming threat, but that life imprisonment was inevitable, Joseph McEnroe changed his strategy. In the months following the judge's decision, he pleaded guilty to all 6 counts of first-degree homicide, which was a move intended to avoid any further legal battles that might have prolonged the process. In his plea, McEnroe reiterated his earlier defense that Michelle had dominated their relationship and influenced his actions, but the court was unswayed. His courtroom demeanor and the overwhelming evidence sealed his fate. Michelle Anderson, on her part, accepted full responsibility, showing deep remorse and calling herself a monster during the sentencing phase. She expressed sincere regret for the pain she caused, acknowledging the unimaginable devastation she inflicted on the family and community. Despite her pleas, the judge made it clear that the law demanded a strict sentence for such heinous crimes. Finally, in mid-2013, after nearly 8 years of legal proceedings since the murders, both Michelle Anderson and Joseph McEnroe were formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge emphasized the gravity of their crimes and the need for society's protection from such violent offenders.
Ms. Anderson, the result is pretty much preordained. Ms. Anderson, pursuant to your convictions, the law mandates that I impose 6 consecutive sentences of life imprisonment without the possibility of release or parole, plus a sentence of enhancement of 60 months on each count as well. I will impose the mandatory victims assessment penalty, the DNA fee. Restitution will be set at a separate proceeding, which you may waive your presence at if you so desire. I will waive all other non-mandatory fees and assessments, and that will be the order of the court.
But no matter how much justice has finally been served, the horrific memories of that terrible night still haunt everyone involved. What's truly heartbreaking is that there's no one left to mourn the Anderson family anymore, except for the very people who took their lives and a handful of close friends who managed to survive the nightmare. One of those friends, Linda, had to relive the trauma again and again throughout the entire trial, forced to revisit the worst day of her life in vivid detail while testifying, making sure the pain stayed etched into her memory forever. The small town of Carnation hasn't been the same since that awful Christmas Eve. To this day, you can bet that locals still whisper about the horrors that happened in that big house just up the road. The mobile home and the storage shed where it all unfolded still stand, silent witnesses to a nightmare that changed the community forever. It's like a shadow hanging over the place, a dark chapter that no one really wants to talk about but can't forget. So what do you think about this case? Do you believe Michelle and Joseph deserved the death penalty for what they did? Or is life without parole the right kind of punishment for such monstrous actions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you've made it this far, be sure to check out this next video. I think you'll enjoy it. Thank you once again for watching.